It all started on a night not unlike most nights. I of course knew the bakery they were speaking of. It was my grandmother's who had passed away some years back, but as far as I and the rest of the family knew, the bakery was doing very well in the hands of my cousin. Why this letter found its way to me instead of them, I couldn't be sure, but I knew I had to investigate. The next morning, I got to work packing up my home. I'd only been living there for a number of months, so it wasn't too hard to leave behind. Though I would miss the beauty of the night sky out here against the snowscape. I took the opportunity to explore on my way to Elora and came across an abandoned portal. If I were still an adventurer, I might have found these tools useful, but they didn't serve any real purpose in village life. I hadn't spent much time in Elora as a child, but something about it felt wrong, and as I entered, I knew the town had fallen on hard times. The berry fields were barren, many of the main establishments were closed for business, and the streets were eerily quiet. I had arrived late, so after I spent the night in the bakery, I went searching the town for clues to my cousin's location. The shopkeeper hadn't heard from him in a long while. I asked if he had a ladder I could use to reach the attic, but he suggested asking the tavern keeper in the housing district instead. The tavern keeper didn't have a ladder or any news, but he did suggest I gather some sticks from the back, and asked me to bring him any sweet berries if I found them on my travels. With the sticks, I was able to make some ladders and finally gain access into the bakery attic. It seems the old business had been abandoned, and before I could even ask myself if I wanted to take on this challenge, someone came to the bakery. Well, I'd been in business for 10 minutes and was already out 20 gold. Why not? I asked myself. If we failed, but at least we can say we tried. And so began the tale of my ownership of ye old bakery. There was just one problem. We didn't have anything to bake with. I may not have mastered the craft yet, but I knew we needed to start with yeast, which meant I'd need to speak to the local mushroom lady. Who, of course, didn't have any mushrooms for me, but she did offer to pay handsomely if I collected some for her. An adventure would require time, something I didn't have, but without a resource to bake, I had nothing to save the bakery with either, so I agreed. And a quest required gear. Unfortunately, the general store had also fallen on hard times and had nothing of iron to give me. She did offer me a number of stone tools and a shield for 10 gold, then suggested I bring her back iron to upgrade her own offerings and my gear. I stopped by a neighboring village to borrow some more basic supplies like torches and bread, and they also had an extra set of leather armor available, so I went ahead and borrowed that. A taiga was what I needed to find for both the sweet berries and mushrooms. Thankfully, there wasn't one too far away. On my travels, I found a ruin. Of what, I wasn't sure, but it was nestled so carefully into the hillside, it made me wonder what sort of culture may have created it and where its inhabitants were now. After foraging some of the mushrooms, I went in search of berries. These took me much longer to find and drew me deep into the wood. The iron was even more of a struggle, leading me into more than one battle. If I were really just a baker, this could have been perilous. I returned first the sweet berries, earning me 10 gold from the tavern keeper. The mushroom lady paid the 15 promised. And finally, I received 10 buckets, iron pants and shoes, and 30 gold from the store manager. I then spent 20 of that on eggs and sugar for the bakery. So after our adventuring and questing, we had profited 5 gold. Nonetheless, I was determined to turn the 50 we inherited into the thriving business I knew this bakery could be. Many days had passed since I received the letter and I had barely baked one batch of goodies. With determination in my heart, I raced outside to sell what I could. Unfortunately, the universe hated me and decided to rain that day. The next morning, the deluge cleared and I was able to sail for the village across the river. They weren't interested at first, not knowing me well enough to do business with. But after I rescued most of them from the canal, they bought, albeit at half price, all of the goods. The next day, there was a package waiting for me. It contained a simmerpot key and a letter. It seems the money and quest I had invested in the town was already starting to pay off. The pot would allow me to make more complicated sweets, and the key belonged to an abandoned house, so I wouldn't have to sleep on the bakery floor anymore. I decided to finish moving in another time and instead looked around to see what had changed. I met a man selling fruit who asked me to bring him jam to resell at his stall. For that, I needed to find apples and strawberries. There were oak trees not too far away, though the apples were few and far between them. After realizing breaking the bushes would give me very little fruit, I adjusted my strategy to use bone meal and grow more. I turned a number of the berries into seeds and gifted them to the fisherman that owned the old strawberry patch property. Berries in hand, I made a few jars of jam and a lot of apple pies. This time, the villagers were more willing to trade and bought all of our goods at full price. The next morning, I found myself rereading my cousin's letter, hoping for some clues as to where they might have gone. During my reminiscence, the shopkeeper arrived for their order of 10 apple pies to resell on her journey. It seemed she would be heading off to search for exotic flowers somewhere while her husband stayed home and minded the store. With her order, we had a whopping 256 gold, over halfway to our goal. She also told me to visit the shop where they'd received a letter intended for the bakery. Apparently, the money my cousin took off with was half the payment from a high-profile client who would be arriving in a matter of days and expected their goods, or their 100 gold back. This wouldn't be a big deal if it didn't require some seriously rare items. The store manager had the part I would need to fix the baking station, but no idea where to find glowberries. Though I'm sure he would have helped me if he could anyways, I bribed the fruit stand man with a sandwich. Still, he did not know where to look, but he did tell me of a new resident who might have my answer. The library had been inaccessible when I first arrived. Thankfully, with a little bit of gumption and community spirit, a path had been cleared as part of the town's restoration. The librarian was odd. After a strange game of cat and mouse, she sent me on a quest to find a special artifact in the Lynn. She instructed me to use the teleporter outside and find the ancient cave, if I could. Apparently, the ruins I had found earlier were part of an old merchant society that would make port and trade their goods here. Seems that has long since stopped. As I was investigating, a sudden gust of wind flung me down a very deep and dark hole. Miraculously, I survived with only a few bruises, though I was not happy to be down here. I soon found I wasn't alone in these caves. There was a goblin trader, perhaps a remnant of the ancient society, who gave me a very good deal on iron. I met many a foul creature down here and was desperate to return home. Soon, near the portal, I found a hidden chest, and inside was the artifact I had been charged with locating, the Grimoire of the Lost Merchants Guild. I said my goodbyes to Donovan and used the teleporter to get home with only a day to spare before the client's arrival. The librarian took the grimoire and in exchange gave me 100 gold and 3 cocoa beans. Just as I was getting ready to bake, I realized I was out of eggs. The farmer was gone, so I gathered my eggs and left his payment. I may or may not have let out 1 or 2 or maybe 3 of his chickens in the process, but he'll have to forgive me later. I soon found eggs were not the only thing I needed. I also required sweet berries, something I did not have the foresight to save some before giving to the tavern keeper, who of course was gone, and his apprentice had no idea where they could have been kept. Thankfully, I found a few left by the old patch and made it back just in time to finish the last few desserts. Finishing long after the sunset, I fell back into a chair and passed out in the warmth of the oven. The customer was more than happy with her order and promised to tell everyone she knew to visit us and the thriving town of Elora. With that order done, I was only a stack or so away from reaching the mortgage payment. Thankfully, a ship had sailed into town and the sailors were very interested in buying some baked goods. Our chest full, I went to deliver the overdue payment to the wheat farmer and made them a little friend as a thank you for all of their hard work. The bank man arrived the next morning. The payment made in full, he delivered us the deed to the bakery. I was thrilled and showed him the way to the newly reopened inn. I gave him an apple pie, which he invited me to share, and we had a lovely conversation about the possibilities of expanding the business. And that is how I became the owner of Ye Old Bakery. I doubt my story will end there. What more could the future hold? You ever get that feeling you ought to just leave things be? A wise person would listen to that feeling. I'm not very wise. I could hear them, the family I'd found in this village, calling for me just beyond the hedge, but something beyond myself wouldn't allow me to ignore the Waystone. Alright, that's enough, send me back. But the Waystone would not heed my request, and I realized it was missing something vital. Upon closer inspection, an inscription revealed itself. Great, a broken stone that told riddles! While I was no stranger to adventure, I had grown accustomed to the warmth of my oven and the smell of baked bread, so I hated the idea of being trapped away from home. Off I went in search of assistance, hoping the residents of this land would know how to fix this mess. The natural beauty of the landscape wasn't entirely lost on me, but what time was there for appreciation when I knew the banker was waiting for me back home, when I couldn't remember if I had closed the oven's fire? I found the residents of the village friendly, for the most part. I couldn't help but be curious about their moneyless society and accommodating nature towards strangers. The night was spent in a restless slumber, my spirit yearning for the comfort of my own bed. How I hadn't noticed until the morning, I can't really say, but the stone had taken more from me than my home. It appeared as though my very nature had been altered to that of a phantom. While I was still able to interact with my environment, this certainly complicated things. Seeing no other way about it, I gave running for it the old college try. This was a terrible decision. Just before I was sure to faint, I managed to tap into the hidden ability of the phantom, which allowed me to stand in the sunlight without feeling like I was the one being baked. It also seemed to make me invisible to the naked eye. I wasted no time, unsure how long I could keep this power active, and raced to the apothecary shop. It also seemed the phantom state allowed me to pass through solid material, which made climbing the stairs unnecessarily difficult. The apothecary had no answers about the stones, but he did give me a rather cryptic note he wasn't brave enough to deliver himself. The air of the mystic's study was old, sitting heavy on the palate, and all of the shelves were caked in dust. I searched for what felt like hours, the sun beating against my translucent skin through the window and making it hard to think. But just as I was about to give up, a book came flying out of the air. Something told me we'd find more answers in this old grove. Perhaps the apothecary would know how to find it. I appreciated his offer. A private space would certainly be nicer than a bunk in the tavern if I had to be here that long, but I certainly hoped I wouldn't have need of it. Even still, the space was very cozy. The journey to the meadow was not easy, but I thankfully arrived at night, which allowed me to search for the herbs the mystic's tea would require, and the second waystone. As I searched, I noticed a strange light over the hill. There were lanterns, ornate ones at that, lazily floating around an opening in the cherry trees. My heart sank as the reality of the mystic's plans and the certain heartbreak of the baker finally hit me. I became determined to help them in any way that I could. My search was fruitless all through the night, but in a race against the sunrise, I finally found it. I didn't think the entrance was meant to be buried. The dirt was softly packed together and some of the edges still had rough patches of grass. Perhaps there was some event that disturbed this area in some way. The hairs on the back of my neck raised, and I knew I was not the only presence in this cave. I called for the mystic to give me some sort of sign he was near. My suspicion confirmed, I allowed myself to be led through this waystone into a third. It brought me to a dark room where I found the ring he was planning to propose to the baker with, and another letter that had never reached her. It was time to have a conversation with the baker, one I didn't imagine she would welcome. After I showed her the letters I had found, she was more than willing to believe me and followed me back to the cherry grove. It seems the legend was true. The moment she touched the stone, his spirit was freed from it. But we weren't out of the woods yet. We were both still trapped as phantoms. He explained that while he couldn't leave, he was gifted enough with magic to affect the town and had been trying to get someone to realize what had happened for ages, though he had no idea how I ended up here. As fate would have it, the solution to our forms was hidden within the guide I had received from the apothecary. The flasks in questions required some combination of water, glistering melon, hibiscus, redstone dust, and lavender, which meant foraging and mining, which meant acquiring tools. I figured the tavern keeper would be the best person to ask and dashed right back to the village. Though not without cost, the tavern keeper's wife did offer to help, on the basis I could get her back her hat from a resident enchantress. This ultimately sent me to the market at the end of the row. Something told me there was more to the farmer v enchantress v tavern keeper story, but I chose to mind my business on that. When I went back to the meadow, I had very little luck finding the hibiscus. And when the sun rose, I used my phantom state to drop deep within the ground, deciding to use the daytime to find the gold and redstone dust. Being in the caves was dispiriting. They were so similar to the ones back home, it reminded me of the days before the bakery. But then it reminded me of my bakery. I wondered what my friends were up to back home, if they worried for me or had even noticed I was gone, if they thought I had abandoned them. You see, that's the problem with stone. It's so quiet, it leaves so much room to think. Once I was finished with my ore collection, I returned to the surface under cover of night. I first returned the amethyst to the enchantress. Then I went to ask the apothecary's permission to use his cauldron. Neither were available, most likely sleeping like any sane person would have been. I had forgotten the watermelons, but luckily there was a small patch at the edge of the village. I also realized I'd forgotten to brew the apothecary any of the tea he'd requested. A quick stop at our temporary home and I had a warm cup ready to deliver. Though it probably wouldn't be so warm by the time he got up in the morning. The armor flask went smoothly enough, but the damaged flask needed lavender stems, and for that, I needed to find shears. Flask in hand, I made my way back to the cherry cave where the lovers awaited. And at once, we were ourselves again. The mystic delivered to me the item I needed to get the waystone working again, and they went off to have a very special moment. The prospect of returning home too much to bear, I paid no mind to the thought of goodbyes. If the stone was working, I could simply return whenever I wished. But I needed to see my own friends again, and I had an intense craving for my specialty glowberry tart. Not this again. It's not that there was little to be said about the night. It's just that he said very little. There wasn't much point explaining that I wasn't any sort of criminal, bandit, thief, or trespasser, but that I was lost from my home with the sole intent of returning to such a place, and had no interest in endangering whatever sort inhabited this village. No, there wasn't much sense in explaining anything, when he did most of his communicating with the uncomfortable end of a rather pointy stick. Could I have slipped away? Perhaps. But the territory was unfamiliar, and once again I found myself stripped of any resources. Alone, without tools or resources, amongst the night dwellers in the wood did not seem like something I would find enjoyable. Even still, when I found myself on the wrong end of an iron door, abandoned even by my imprisoner, I wondered if the creepers would have been more accommodating. I'm not much of one for tight spaces, so I broke my way out the side-facing window and dashed to an unlocked building at the end of the village. Not seeing any pursuers, I allowed myself to rest in the larder that night. The next morning, I realized I had found my way into a church worshipping some sort of horned deity. I helped myself to the available bread and took a look at what was most likely their holy book. Religion was never really my strong suit, and seeing as I couldn't read their text anyways, it would have to stay that way. My reading was interrupted by a priest who seemed equally surprised by my arrival as he was amused by my prison break. He offered his knowledge of Waystones if I assisted him in removing a witch's thrall and rescuing his precious buffalo. I informed him killing things wasn't really my job, and almost by divine intervention, I was roped into ending an Enderman. Once that was over, I snuck my way over to the witch's tower, where I was almost immediately spotted. She didn't seem to chase me outside though, so I crept up to the buffalo pen to see what I was dealing with. Something about attacking the golem just felt wrong, and I didn't quite trust the priest's tone, so I went with my gut and confronted the witch instead. As suspected, the situation was much more complicated than I was led to believe, and not at all my business in the first place. After explaining my situation, the witch informed me my best chance of getting home was one of the waystones inside of the castle. But after the incident, none of their attempts to penetrate the barrier had been successful, and her waystone was left inert. She had no real answers on what the incident was beyond the ground suddenly shook one day, the barrier went up, and nothing was truly the same again. I'm not one to believe in things such as fate, but my arrival here, just after being given the mechanism to fix Waystones, felt entirely too coincidental. Thankfully, she was good-spirited and humored me long enough for me to prove effective. The witch followed me, and as I followed her, unsure where to find anything in this gorgeously mystical castle, she informed me that if I hadn't seen my home in the Waystone, then the only one with the power to create a new portal would be their goddess, whom they hadn't seen since the incident. Summoning the goddess was both of our best chances, so she would give me any assistance I required. It seemed this particular spirit had a love of cheese and required each of 7 different variations, as well as 2 specialty treats offered to her to return to the mortal plane. Before leaving, the witch asked me to keep our plans to myself, not interested in arguing with the priest. She also told me the old cheese factory had been abandoned by the village, so I would be more than welcome to take residence there. Despite its supposed abandonment, the cheese factory was warm and smelled of fresh air. Someone, or something, had been around to nurture the spirit of the place. The first thing I noticed was a pedestal, which thankfully detailed the types of milk I would need to find, and I imagine the frames on the wall were for their displays. The storeroom was entirely empty and there was no food to be found, but I did come across a pair of fur boots. I had no interest in wandering this world defenseless, so I began this journey, as I had so many before, punching a tree. I needed tools, but even more desperately, I needed food. For some odd reason, I seemed to forget my natural aversion to water and jumped straight into the river. This did not help my hunger situation. After evoking the living privileges from a few helpless creatures, I headed beneath the earth for a few more resources. The small cavern was gracious enough to offer both coal and iron, and I went further than I was planning, eventually forced to return when I ended up on the wrong side of a creeper without a shield to defend me. With food and resources secured, I turned my attention back to the task at hand, making cheese. I started by replacing the missing cheese press, costing only a few slabs and a couple sticks, then began to familiarize myself with the process. Each cheese required a vial of rennet and the corresponding milk. Rennet required an egg, alpine salt, and a glass bottle. And alpine salt seemed to be a mix of water and calcite. The only components in the place seemed to be buckets used to collect the milk and the glass vials for the rennet. But I am not one to back down from a challenge, and part of me was intrigued by the idea of meeting a goddess. Water wouldn't be a challenge, there were rivers running directly through the village. Eggs wouldn't be too difficult either, I was sure I had passed a coop on the way to the factory. However, the calcite and a number of the milks were sure to prove a challenge. I went searching first for eggs, coming across the gentleman who ignored me the previous night. Apparently, the village was worse on its luck than I realized, and the chicken farmer ate all of the chickens. I don't typically tell people how to do their job, but I don't think that's how it should work. Either way, I was offered his last bottle of rennet if I brought him more poultry. I found another chicken almost immediately, but one was not sufficient, and a second was much harder to come by. In my search, I stumbled across another village, where I gathered my first milk from a cow and used their waystone to teleport back. Eventually, a second chicken was located, and the farmer, somewhat reluctantly, fulfilled his end of the bargain. And like so, the first cheese wheel was crafted. The cheese press took a very long time to complete, so I made a second one to speed up the production time for the coming wheels. I also added a milk bucket to the wall as a sign of completion. While the first one was relatively simple, if that was the last bottle of rennet near, then a lack of salt was the biggest concern. I'd also noticed a mine near the witch's cottage, so acquiring calcite and amethyst milk became the next objective. There was a lookout over the mine entrance where I found a note. Whoever the miner was clearly made a huge mistake, and this village's secrets were about to spill open. Hoping to find whoever the note was written to, I went searching for a tea shop. And eventually stumbled into the shop. The tea lady informed me that the miner had abandoned her after the incident, but she was crying the night before about a fight with her father, the priest. She doesn't know what happened or if the miner had anything to do with the incident, but the spirit of everyone in town fell to ruin when she stopped bringing salt for the offerings. Per suggestion, I went to speak the forager for some equipment and was asked to do more than make offerings for this one season, instead to help them renew what was lost. It would take little more effort for me to help the community as well as myself, so I agreed. This sent me to the engineer. He gave me rail tracks, which would hopefully allow them to mine their ores again. Redstone was never my forte, but reconnecting the rail system seemed simple enough. I soon found, however, the broken tracks were the least of the problems. I don't know what I expected to find, but an unexploded block of TNT and a desolate geode were not in my wildest machinations. With limited options and some history with mining, I set out to find another geode. Super annoying mid-video plug. It is my goal to hit 100,000 subscribers this year, so please subscribe if you haven't, and don't forget to like the video. Also, I launched merch, which includes these super cute stickers that I make, package, and ship myself, as well as some very cozy apparel. Okay, thank you, bye. This took me deep within the earth, eventually stumbling upon a fair number of diamonds. Wisdom would have kept me from jumping down this ledge, but we've already gone over that. I found an opening and secured the last diamond, but soon completely lost my way in the dark and became besotted on all sides by monsters. With some luck, I had stumbled my way back to the miner's grotto, which allowed me a moment of safety and rest before continuing my search for a new geode. I took only what I thought I would need, focusing more on the calcite than the amethyst itself, and began a new track for the village. I created a hovel at the top where one could potentially rest and store their items on long expeditions into the stone. My first attempt at checking my rails was partially successful. On the second, I managed to actually be in the minecart, but not before it left me down there. And it worked. I also checked to make sure the old one was now working, though I would need to make a stop somewhere in the middle to connect the two. Back at the factory, I made the first batch of alpine salt and found some very unwelcomed company. I also discovered I needed amethyst clusters, not blocks, which sent me straight back to the witches. Greenie, as she seemed to be called, was more than happy to assist me, and enchanted my iron pick with silk touch. I used it to gather enough clusters I wouldn't soon need to return, and made the amethyst milk and cheese wheel. I then sliced both wheels into pieces for the offerings. And as soon as the offerings were in their pedestals, one of the barrier beacons disappeared. This brought me to the goat, sheep, and grain cheeses, in a village with no goats, sheep, or grain. During my investigations of the old barn, I was found by the baker. She said it burned down long after the incident, but the spirit was gone before the structure. She brought me to the tavern, where I could find the sheep farmer now served hops. The tavern keeper told me the barn burned down on accident, but none of her animals were able to produce good milk anyways. She had enough feed to keep them going for a while, but the church controlled the grain and wouldn't answer anyone why there were no more disbursements. She had to abandon the trade and eventually worked out a deal with the knight to offer his specialty mead in her tavern. So it seemed for all three cheeses I would need to begin another adventure. As I was leaving, she suggested I speak to the town recorder. If anyone could get an official answer from the priest, it was her. Officially speaking, the wheat fields caught a disease and no new seeds would grow. She wasn't sure if it was a disease that plagued the fields, but thanks to his use of church land as a community garden, no one ever went hungry. My path brought me from forest to fields, where I found an abandoned nether portal and a few bits of obsidian, something I was sure to need since the final cheese required warped milk. I'd never known the nether to have cows, but perhaps it was a region-specific phenomenon. I also stumbled across not one, but 2 new villages and a safe haven. I only took what I needed for my return trip, thankful to have found respite from the bitter cold. Hidden amongst the ruins of an ancient civilization were a handful of oat seeds and some usable grain. Maybe these seeds could replace the wheat that would not grow for the villagers. After gathering a number of interesting artifacts, I went back to exploring the snowscape in search of a mountain goat. The lasso the tavern keeper provided me was far more useful than I had imagined, acting as more a storage chest than a lead. I snagged a few buckets of milk from a wild sheep and completed the 3 items I had searched for. I named the goat Bertha and hid her within the storage room for the time being. The sheep, grain, and goat's cheese were now marked complete, and this time a beacon disappeared for each piece that was delivered, weakening its barrier even further. To my surprise, the witch had buffalo cheese waiting for me, and another secret hidden within her walls. The portal needed 4 obsidian to be complete, so I retrieved the diamonds I had found earlier, a couple buckets of lava, and crafted a diamond pick. My first trip was relatively painless, spawning in the realm I needed to be and near me a warped cow. But this wouldn't be my last time here in this tale. When I left the factory the next day, ready to deliver my next batch of offerings, the night my imprisoner, was standing outside staring directly at me. But then, he really wasn't staring at me. He was just standing there, staring, unmoving, unspeaking. I wondered how the tavern keeper managed to work any kind of deal with him. Anyways, I left to find some ebony wood to match the fences that already existed at the old barn. It was time for Bertha to get out of my storage room and enjoy the open air again. At first I thought maybe the carpet allowed her to jump over. But no, Bertha was just a troublemaker. I told myself I would come back and make this pretty later, maybe, but for now it was good enough to hold her. A door, where previously there hadn't been. It seems someone had indeed noticed the disappearing beacons and the energetic shift in the air. It was the priest, in a rather depressed state. As I had gathered, he was indeed to blame for the incident, putting his daughter to the task of extracting far too much mineral far too quickly. They were reckless with the blessings of the earth, and everyone paid the price for it. He also told me the final offerings had only ever been prepared by the Moss Knight, lost within his silent mind. Hoping against hope, I now set out to find a healing potion that might, even temporarily, return his senses. This time it was Red, the witch's other apprentice, who offered assistance. The brewing stand was in desperate need of power, and if I wanted her to make me a potion, I would need to fetch a blaze rod. I approached this task as I had in the past, barricading myself within throwing distance and picking off whichever I could reach. Eventually, I had cleared a way for me to pearl over and grab one blaze rod, and then raced back to the overworld. It was sufficient, providing just enough power for one splash potion of healing. I couldn't be sure if the Moss Knight didn't remember our first meeting or simply didn't care, but it became apparent he had no idea what I was asking of him. In the moment of clarity it afforded him, no words were exchanged, but he did write down the recipes I needed to complete the summoning. A cheesecake and a cheese tart, and I was only short a few ingredients. Before completing these recipes, I made a point to plant the oat seeds on the church land, sowing a new future for the community. Back at the castle, everyone I had met, and a few unfamiliar faces, were waiting for me. It was eerily quiet and more than a little discomforting, but who could blame them? This was the last thread of hope not only for myself, but the whole village. In a flash, she was here. Awesome and beautiful. She was unlike anything I'd seen before, and yet strangely familiar, perhaps connected through distant Endarian roots. She promised to return what had been lost from her people, and granted me the ability to control the Waystones. What adventure took me next, be it home, exploring this world, or somewhere new, was a fate entirely in my hands. Thank you for 20,000 little crows, and if you rock with the free peoples of Earth, check out the resources in the video description. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and I can't wait to see you in the next one.